on the street where my mother lived, or rather, on the street perpendicular to it, but very close, there lived an old woman. In fact, you couldn't really call her a grandmother back then. She was more like an aunt. But everyone knew there was something fishy about this woman. My maternal grandmother said that people were afraid to talk to this woman because she had a very strong temper and a reputation to match. The grandmother said that a neighbor had gotten into an argument with her at the bathhouse. The only running water there was still street pumps. There were no baths, and anyone without their own bathhouse or running water had to use the city's common one. And the witch told her that she would die in exactly 2 weeks. And so it happened. The neighbor fell ill and rapidly began to waste away, until exactly 2 weeks later, she gave up her soul to God. I didn't witness this, and am retelling it from my grandmother's words, but there are some things I witnessed firsthand. One man, with his family and 3 children, accidentally knocked over a bench near her fence with his car, and the fence itself fell. Well, that's just how it goes. But the woman started cursing at him, and the man got angry in response. They had a really heated argument. I was sent there to live with my grandmother for the summer instead of going to camp, and I remember the transformation of this man's family well, even though I wasn't very old. 1 year, the family was normal and well off, but when I returned the next year, I didn't even recognize them at first. Long story short, the man descended into severe alcoholism and stabbed his wife. The eldest son was already an adult, and the other 2, a boy my age and a very young daughter, were left under his care. However, he either became a drug addict or turned to crime, leaving these 2 little ones to fend for themselves. Long story short, his family, which had been quite ordinary 1 year, suddenly fell apart at the seams, and when I returned the following year, I found only 2 penniless youngsters. What I noticed was that the boy my age had seriously lost his mind. Since we were somewhat acquainted, he somehow dragged me into his ruined house and, as if playfully, began stitching his mouth shut with some kind of needle. Well, he didn't stitch it all the way, of course, but he definitely made a couple of zip ties. I was in complete shock. My grandmother had strictly forbidden me to speak to them even before this incident. But what did I care? And by the 3rd year, they were gone entirely. Either someone had taken them into their care, or they had moved away on their own. My grandmother also said that the woman cast spells using needles. I remember a related incident that struck me as a shock. I woke up in the morning to find the house in turmoil. Not exactly panic, but a tense bustle. My grandmother kept running in and out of the house, and my mother was absolutely hysterical. My grandmother told me, under no circumstances should I go near the gate or touch it. Absolutely not. Then she led me to the gate, and I saw 2 large sewing needles on it. Yes, they were just lying there. But then my grandmother explained what kind of needles they were and who had put them there. And here's what my mother told me. When she was young, right after college, she worked at a local factory. Work there was done in shifts. That is, the first shift was as usual. The second was from 2 until 10 in the evening, and the third was from 10 in the evening until the morning. And it was intermittent, meaning 1 week you'd work one shift and then another. So, returning from the second shift, already dark, down the street where the woman's house was, Mum saw a dark figure on the roof, lightly banging on the chimney with a stick. Mum was scared, but she had to get home somehow, so she started walking quickly past the house, keeping an eye on this guy. Then, apparently, the guy heard her footsteps and stopped banging, and then my mum was completely horrified. The guy turned his head in her direction, and she realized it wasn't a person at all. Even though it was dark, Mum saw his eyes, and they were definitely not human, but large and round, and they glowed like a cat's eyes. Mum ran home. Well, that's all just a preamble. Now the real story begins. I actually have an older sister. She's quite the womanizer. One day, she disappeared from home and didn't come home for the night. She didn't come back once, twice, and her parents got worried. But then she contacted me and said she wasn't coming home anymore. Everyone was confused. Her parents were shocked. Her then boyfriend was shocked. They started looking into it. I asked her what was going on, and it turned out she was now living with some guy and didn't want to come home. Her parents were wondering, who is this guy? It turned out his last name was exactly the same as that woman down the street, and he was her biological grandson. This alarmed my mother. My sister refused to contact my parents, for some reason trying to contact me. I was in 9th grade at the time. One thing led to another, and the following situation emerged. This guy gave my sister a ride from one neighborhood to another, and somehow convinced her to go to his house. My sister couldn't say anything coherent about what happened after that. They started digging into this guy and discovered he was a heroin addict and a generally vile character. At first, they didn't pay attention to his relationship with that old woman, believing the reason was much more prosaic. For example, they thought he was blackmailing her or had gotten her hooked on drugs. They went to the address with the police, but my sister said she was living there of her own free will. And then, something strange happened. One day, my sister called me and said, "I'll be back home, just meet me." I went to the address, but my sister wasn't there. She wasn't answering her phone, but some woman was there. It turned out the woman was waiting for me and was the guy's mother. The woman was pretty scary looking, but I wouldn't say she was particularly striking. She asked me some questions, then grabbed my hand and dragged me over, like, "You're looking a bit skinny. We'll feed you now." I was like, "Wait a minute, lady. I don't eat with strangers, especially when I'm meeting them for the first time." The woman was stubborn, saying, "Let's go, no talking." I was stubborn too, and she started holding my hand tighter and getting downright rude. I thought, what a fool. I broke free and ran away. I told my parents. They shrugged, but realized something was fishy. My father later gathered some of his tougher friends, caught the guy, and threatened that if my sister didn't come home, he'd be in trouble. And he was like, "She's with me of her own free will. There's nothing you can do." Well, they beat me up, but still, things didn't move forward. From time to time, my sister would ask me to bring her things from home to work, and I'd carry them for her, listening to her stories. Gradually, my sister's appearance became noticeable. She'd lost a lot of weight and aged. Of course, not to the point of looking old, but she was noticeably unattractive. Her cheeks were hollow. There were bags under her eyes. Her hair was falling out. The next thing was her voice. It also changed, becoming more masculine. Of course, all this didn't happen overnight, but over the course of several months. And here's what my sister told me. Basically, she's stupid. And for some reason, all these oddities didn't bother her much at first. There were 3 of us in her new family, not counting her. An alcoholic father, a mother, and their son. The father drank and didn't really make a splash, but the son and his mother were the ones who really rocked it. The first thing that amused my sister was that they didn't take a bath at all, only the banya once a week. And not in the city, but outside the city, in their native village. My sister's food was cooked in separate dishes, which they themselves didn't use. They fed her a lot, but despite this, my sister's weight steadily decreased. They also slept strangely. Once, my sister woke up in the middle of the night, opened her eyes, and saw the guy lying across from her, eyes open, mouth wide open, inhaling greedily. Moreover, their house was filled with icons, and the guy prayed in the evenings. Moreover, as my sister said, he didn't pray like ordinary people, but in an incomprehensible language, unlike Russian. When she asked him, "What are you doing? Are you crazy?" he would say, "No, I'm a true Orthodox Christian. Don't bother me." I told my parents these stories, and they were deeply perplexed. However, it slowly began to dawn on my sister herself where she had ended up. There was a very strange story that affected me personally during those days. One night, I was sitting at the computer, playing Cossacks, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought my parents had gone to the bathroom or the kitchen. Then I realized they were definitely not human footsteps. They were too light and cautious. I listened further. I heard footsteps turning into the kitchen, rustling, the clink of teaspoons in mugs. I began to panic, realizing it wasn't my parents. The footsteps from the kitchen returned to the hallway, and then I started to shudder. I heard the jingle of scissors lying on the dressing table. They were metal and slightly loose, so the sound was unmistakable. I decide to run from the room to my parents, but I have to run through the hallway. I gather all my willpower, rush into the hallway, eyes closed, and quickly run to my parents. They're fast asleep. I wake them up and say, "So-and-so, let's go look." I don't know where those scissors were originally, but the icons in the kitchen, my parents are Orthodox, but not fanatically, are lying face down. And the next time I saw my sister, she told me that the guy had some kind of violent fit, foaming at the mouth, after which he described the layout of our apartment down to the stool, even though he'd never been there. Each time, my sister's stories became stranger. One night, she couldn't sleep and noticed a strange sound coming from the courtyard at night, like children playing, but somehow too quietly. Then the sound got closer and seemed to roll from the street through the open balcony into the next room. My sister started waking up the guy, and he told her, "Don't be afraid, they're just devils. They often come to visit us." It got more interesting. A distant relative of theirs died in their village, the one with the bathhouse. They went there. My sister described the funeral like this. When it was time to lower the coffin into the ground, the guy chased everyone away about 20 meters and started pacing around with a book, muttering something. Then he rubbed the deceased's forehead with his fingers and then rubbed his own forehead. Oh, and here's an interesting detail. Contrary to popular belief about everyone's fondness for cats, the guy hated them. According to my sister, he was actually quite afraid of them. My mother soon found out the address of some knowledgeable old woman and wanted to visit her. I don't know how she found out the old woman's address, but they seem to have known each other long before these events. My grandmother lived in a village about 50 kilometers outside the city. It was my mother's first time traveling alone. Upon arrival, I began asking her what had happened and who this grandmother was. My mother said she looked perfectly ordinary. What struck her was that she somehow knew she had not only a daughter, but also a son, me, even though she'd never even mentioned me to her. And the most interesting thing was that she immediately said she knew who was behind all this, naming a specific person. It was that sinister woman from the street who happened to be our passenger's grandmother. This fact shocked everyone, including my skeptical father, who, after this story, abandoned his skepticism. Needless to say, I myself began to take the events seriously. My grandmother said she didn't need money, even though my mother had offered a rather generous reward for help. She said something had affected us that shouldn't have affected us. What was especially strange to me was that the old woman invited me to talk to her personally. I was seriously scared, but what could I do? Next time, my mother and I would go alone. We arrived in the morning. The house was just like any other house, nothing sinister. The old woman told my mother to go outside while she talked to me. When I heard that, I almost fainted. The old woman really was just like any other. We entered the house, walked through the entryway, and into the room where there sat a huge sheep cat. The cat was very large and sat right across from the entrance. The old woman told me to say hello to Timofey Matveyevich first. It took me a while to realize she was talking about the cat. I said hello, not without some trepidation, and suddenly all my fears somehow disappeared, and I began to feel quite at ease. We sat down at the table and, after a short silence, began to talk. She asked if I knew what had happened to my sister. I told her what I knew, and then she asked again if I knew what really had happened. I said I didn't. Anyway, the old woman told me that the family of that old woman down the street, okay, her name was Zenaida. Otherwise, it's just one old woman after another. You can't tell one from the other. Well, this Zenaida family is a complicated one. And they have a problem. There's no one to continue the family. Their son is no good for anything. They need a daughter. And they need my sister specifically to give birth to a girl and nothing else. As soon as she gets pregnant and gives birth, she'll die right away, she says. And in the meantime, they're all sucking every drop of juice out of her. I started cautiously asking how it happened that she left in the first place. And the old woman says they put a love spell on her. But it's not a simple spell. It's on food and drink. Whoever eats their food is at their mercy. I got scared, remembering how I barely escaped the clutches of their mother, who insistently offered me a meal at their place. I told my grandmother about that incident, and she said, "I did the right thing. That's why you're sitting here, because you know without knowing." I felt uneasy, and she said, "Don't be shy, just listen. If you think this is some kind of witchcraft, you're a fool. It's not witchcraft or magic. Magic," she said, "is everything else, and these things are nature itself." So she said, "I'll help you, but only because Zenaida's family doesn't want to continue. If a daughter wasn't born, she never will be. That's the decision. So she won't take any money or anything at all." I asked what she meant by knowing without knowing. She said, "That's precisely why my sister deals with me as an intermediary, because I am an intermediary. It's just a quality I have. You're barred from these matters," she said, "but you still have some kind of quality. But this quality is worthless. There's nothing to teach you," she says, "but I can help you be more attentive." I completely lost all feeling at this point. I thought, what a turn of events. And the old woman continues, "Look, if you get involved in these things, you'll never get out, so stay out of it." I say, I won't." Then I asked, "What do you mean by be more attentive? What should I pay attention to?" And she replies, "Keep an eye on people more often, and you'll immediately understand who's in trouble and who's not. You'll sense it in your gut. You just won't realize it yourself." And she also says, "Don't go to the local churches." And our city, it must be said, is very religious, but strange. Okay, never mind confidentiality and all that nonsense. It's Sarov in the south of the Nizhny Novgorod region, a closed nuclear center, but also the birthplace of one of the most revered saints, Seraphim of Sarov. There are quite a lot of worshippers and pilgrims, despite the access control. But the old woman tells me the place is now a lost cause, a lowland. So, she says, don't go to church, don't light candles. Incidentally, this was later confirmed by a strange old pilgrim I chatted with at a bus stop a couple of years ago. He said the local churches only breed devils, and the place has long since ceased to be holy. He said he was some kind of wandering priest and knew all the places here and beyond the Urals. Actually, there's an interesting story about this old pilgrim. Not a scary one, but amusing. He was simply standing at the bus stop. He must have been resting, since you wouldn't know he used public transportation. He had grey hair and a beard. I was just waiting for a bus. But he engaged me in conversation, and I missed a couple of buses. He said he didn't actually live anywhere, but spent the nights with people who would shelter him. I asked, "So, was there ever a case where no one would shelter you?" He said, "No, there wasn't. You have to say the right words, and then they'll let you in for life. That's how he lives," he said. He said he was actually a priest. Even showed his ID. It turns out that's what they do. But he doesn't dress up as a priest and doesn't wear a cross. He said it's rare to find a real church. Even though some places are considered holy, that's not true. Both here and in Diveyevo, everything has long since rotted, and going to the local churches is simply pointless. But in the villages, he said, there are still some real parishes left. Anyway, let's get back to the old woman. So she tells me, you sense in your gut if something's wrong with someone. That's just your nature. And as for my sister, she says, it's a terrible, but not hopeless matter. Only Zenaida herself can remove the love spell, and we, she says, will force her to do it. She says you're needed in this matter, specifically as an intermediary. Listen carefully to what your sister tells you and pass it on faithfully. Then she told me to call my mother. I went out, and before I did, she told me to say goodbye to the cat. I said goodbye. Then things unfolded like this. The old woman said she'd make Zenaida leave her sister. But it's a complicated matter. She started working with my mother, who started visiting her every week. I wasn't told all the details, although I actively tried to figure out what was going on. And I did figure out a few things. Mum would buy live roosters at the market, not just any kind, but some with a particular appearance. Every full moon, she'd chop off their heads and do something with them. I don't know what exactly, but it required some herbs and a lot of peppercorns. My grandmother gave Mum a book, and she'd read it from there about what to do with the roosters. I only caught a glimpse of the book. They wouldn't let me near it, but I'm not sure, but that's what it seemed. It was handwritten and not very thick. Mum would write words out of it in a specific order. Then, having performed the necessary actions on the rooster and the book, she'd go to the cemetery between midnight and 1 o'clock during the full moon and bury the rooster's head at a grave, a different one each time, but not random. The grave had to be indicated by the grandmother. She'd name people, and Mum would then look for them in the cemetery. She did this for 4 months. They did some other things, but I didn't know the details because I wasn't privy to them. Then one day, Mum came home from Grandma's and said my sister would be back in 2 hours or 2 days. So what do you think? She calls me 2 hours later and says, "That's it. Come pick me up." I brought her home. She sat there for a couple of days, barely speaking to her parents. Then, in the rain, she went back out there again. Everyone was confused again. What was going on? Everything had been going well, hadn't it? My sister did start talking to my parents a little after those days. My father, for example, asked her to return the umbrella she'd taken. He'd give her a new one. He came to see her at work, and they exchanged umbrellas. He was walking home, holding the umbrella in his hand, and realized his arm was going numb. The one with the umbrella. He got scared and quickly threw the umbrella away. The arm was almost paralyzed and took a week to recover. From then on, everything that had been in that apartment was simply thrown out. What results did this grandmother's rooster and graveyard machinations yield? Well, here they are, from my sister, who was in constant contact with me. I learned that this same Zenaida had fallen and broken her leg, and a very serious one at that, with an open fracture. She's in the hospital. Perhaps I should tell you what this grandson of hers looked like. To say he was deformed is probably an understatement. His face was quite terrifying, and in addition to the enormous space between his small eyes, he had a hideous, slanted forehead. In short, a complete degenerate. So, Zenaida had a broken leg, and apparently something clicked between them about it. By that time, my sister had become completely ill, completely withered. Our grandmother was alarmed and told my mother that time was running out and she needed to give Zenaida a clear sign to leave her side. I don't know what they did, but after that, this guy's father suddenly hanged himself. My sister said the family was horrified. She described the scene. One evening, the guy stood for a long time, his hands palms against the wall, muttering something. Then he suddenly became enraged and literally dragged my sister out of the apartment by the hair, telling her to get out of here. It's worth describing the mechanism of the love spell itself, what it's like from the perspective of the bewitched person. My sister understood perfectly well the situation she was in and why. That is, she knew perfectly well it wasn't her choice, but she couldn't resist it in any way. She couldn't leave, even though these people were already disgusting to her. So the guy kicked her out, but my sister couldn't leave and spent the night right on the doorstep of the apartment. Whether it took a long time or a short time, they eventually let my sister go because they heeded the warnings. As I understand it now, they realized it was easier to find a new victim than to wage such a confrontation. Zenaida lifted her spell on her sister, and that, too, happened in a very strange way. As my sister said, she was dragged to Zenaida's house. She had already been discharged from the hospital, but she couldn't walk. She was lying on the bed. They brought my sister to her, and Zenaida looked at her, raised her hand, waved it, and said, "Get out of here, so I won't see you here again." And that was it. As my sister says, she immediately felt a terrible revulsion toward these people right after that wave of her hand. She was home that same evening.